Mayday, mayday, mayday! Edwards Tower, this is Viper 27 declaring emergency. Captain Jake Morrison's voice cracked through the static-filled radio at Edwards Air Force Base as his F-16 Fighting Falcon shuddered violently through dense fog at 8,000 feet. The 28-year-old pilot fought to maintain control as his aircraft's hydraulic systems failed catastrophically, leaving him with degraded flight controls and no landing gear indication. Below him, the Mojave Desert was completely obscured by an unexpected fog bank that had rolled in from the west, turning routine training into a life-or-death emergency. Harold Hank Morrison had been watching the unfolding crisis from his position near the maintenance desk in Edwards' control tower. At 76 years old, he looked exactly like his identification claimed, a civilian contractor responsible for facility maintenance. His weathered hands, stained with decades of honest work, gripped a simple clipboard with routine cleaning schedules. He wore his usual faded red work shirt that had survived more wash cycles than most airmen had deployments, blue jeans with permanent grease stains, and worn work boots. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his pale blue eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had spent a lifetime watching aircraft dance between life and death. In the tower, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and his team of air traffic controllers worked frantically to clear airspace and prepare for the emergency landing. Advanced radar systems, computer-assisted approach guidance, and state-of-the-art weather detection equipment filled the tower, but none of it could help a pilot whose aircraft was barely responding to controls in zero visibility conditions. The fog was worsening by the minute, with visibility dropping to less than a quarter mile and crosswinds gusting to 35 knots. Morrison had been employed at Edwards for 18 years, maintaining the facilities that supported some of the most advanced aviation testing in the world. He was invisible to most personnel, just another aging contractor keeping systems operational. The air traffic controllers had barely acknowledged his presence during the developing crisis, treating him with casual dismissal that young professionals often showed elderly maintenance workers. Viper 27, Edwards Tower, Rodriguez transmitted, his voice tight with controlled tension. We're showing you at Angels 8, but your transponder is intermittent. Can you maintain altitude and attempt gear extension? The response was filled with static and strain. Negative, Edwards. I'm losing altitude fast. Hydraulics are gone, flight controls are degraded, and I can't see anything through this soup. Emergency power unit is running hot. Staff Sergeant Chen, the approach controller, studied his radar screen with growing alarm. Sir, he's descending through 7,000 feet, but his glide path is unstable. At this rate and in these conditions, he'll never make a safe approach. Morrison quietly stood and walked toward the radio console, his movement so subtle that most controllers didn't notice. Son, Morrison said to Rodriguez, his voice carrying calm authority that seemed out of place from a maintenance worker. That pilot's fighting the weather instead of using it. Mind if I take a look at your approach pattern? Rodriguez glanced at Morrison with mounting irritation as his pilot continued to lose altitude in deteriorating conditions. Sir, this is an active emergency situation. I need you to clear the tower until we resolve this crisis. Morrison remained where he was, his experienced eyes scanning the weather displays and radar screens with methodical attention that spoke of decades of experience. That fog bank isn't uniform, Morrison observed quietly, pointing to subtle variations on the weather radar that the controllers had missed. There's a microinversion layer at about 200 feet above the runway, creating a temporary ceiling. If you can guide him through the right approach corridor, he'll get visual contact for the last few seconds before touchdown. Staff Sergeant Chen looked up from his console with growing interest. How would you know about microinversion patterns in this type of weather system? Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his bearing. The slight slouch of an elderly maintenance worker straightened into something that looked suspiciously like military posture. I've been guiding aircraft through worse conditions than this since before you were born, son. Different aircraft, different decades, but same basic principles of reading what the atmosphere is actually doing versus what the computers think it should be doing. Morrison's mind suddenly drifted to another time, another place entirely. The Edwards control tower faded away, replaced by the primitive radar screens and crackling radios of Tan Son Nhut Air Base during the monsoon season. He wasn't 76 anymore. He was 29, a technical sergeant with the 834th Air Division, working as a combat approach controller during some of the most dangerous flying conditions imaginable. The year was 1971, and Morrison was responsible for guiding damaged aircraft through zero-visibility monsoon storms while under the constant threat of enemy rocket attack. In that chaotic environment, Morrison had earned a reputation as the controller who could talk anyone down, no matter how desperate the situation. When sophisticated approach systems failed and pilots were disoriented by weather and battle damage, squadron commanders called specifically for Morrison. He possessed an intuitive understanding of weather patterns and aircraft behavior under extreme stress that went beyond technical manuals and electronic guidance systems. Morrison remembered one particular night when a damaged F-4 Phantom, crippled by ground fire and lost in a typhoon, had been attempting to land with no hydraulics and minimal electrical power. The pilot was flying on pure instinct, and the base's electronic approach systems were useless in the storm. Morrison had talked that pilot through a successful landing using nothing but voice guidance, reading wind patterns from audio cues, estimating approach angles by engine sound, and providing the calm confidence that kept the pilot focused when panic would have meant certain death. Back in the present control tower, Morrison's eyes refocused on the young controllers surrounding him. "The thing about zero-visibility approaches," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying authority that made nearby personnel stop their activities, "is that you have to trust your instruments, but you also have to understand what the environment is actually telling you. And right now, the environment is giving your pilot a narrow window of opportunity if you know how to find it." Rodriguez felt his authority challenged during a life-or-death emergency. "Sir, this is classified Air Force operations with a multi-million-dollar aircraft and a pilot's life at stake. I'm going to need you to clear the tower immediately." Morrison remained exactly where he was, his pale blue eyes studying the radar display with methodical attention that spoke of decades of experience reading weather patterns that could mean the difference between life and death. Morrison slowly rolled up his left sleeve, revealing a faded tattoo of an air traffic control tower with wings, the distinctive insignia of military approach controllers. Several controllers stared at the worn tattoo with growing recognition and respect. 32 years of active duty, son. Vietnam, Thailand, Germany, and right here at Edwards before I retired. I've talked pilots through conditions that would make today's weather look like a training exercise. The confrontation had reached a critical decision point when Airman First Class Martinez made a choice that would fundamentally change everything. "Sergeant," Martinez said urgently to Rodriguez, "what if I contact wing operations, just to verify his background and get guidance on this situation?" Rodriguez nodded grimly, realizing they needed answers immediately as the pilot continued to lose altitude. Martinez quickly contacted Chief Master Sergeant Williams at wing headquarters. "Chief, this is Martinez in the tower. We have an F-16 emergency in zero visibility and an elderly civilian contractor claiming to be former military ATC. Says his name is Harold Morrison, and he's advising on non-standard approach procedures." There was a brief pause. Then Williams' voice carried unprecedented urgency that Martinez had never heard before. "Martinez, did you say Harold Morrison, former approach controller?" The silence lasted only seconds, but felt like an eternity. "Sweet Jesus, Martinez, do not interfere with anything Harold Morrison wants to do in that tower. Do you understand me completely? That man has saved more pilots and aircraft than anyone in Air Force history." Martinez felt his world shift as the implications sank in. "Chief, should we—" Williams cut him off immediately. "Put him on the radio with that pilot right now. Harold Morrison is a living legend." The line went dead, leaving Martinez staring at Rodriguez with wide eyes. Morrison had quietly moved to the primary radio console and was already reaching for the microphone. "Mind if I try a different approach with your pilot, son?" Rodriguez, shaken by the chief's reaction, handed over the radio without hesitation. Morrison keyed the microphone, his voice taking on the calm, authoritative tone that had guided countless aircraft through impossible situations. Viper 27, this is Edwards Tower. You have a new controller. I need you to trust me completely and follow my guidance exactly. What's your current altitude, airspeed, and fuel state? Captain Morrison's strained voice came back immediately. Edwards, showing 6,500 feet, airspeed 170 and decreasing. Fuel is getting critical, and I still have no visual contact with anything. Before anyone could process what was happening, they heard multiple vehicles approaching the tower at high speed. The distinctive sound of emergency response and senior command staff mobilizing for a crisis situation. Morrison remained focused on the radio, his voice steady and reassuring despite the chaos building around the tower. Viper 27, I need you to turn left heading 240 and descend to 4,000 feet. I know it sounds wrong, but there's a corridor through this weather that your instruments can't detect. Trust me and fly the aircraft by feel. Captain Morrison's voice came back tense, but following instruction. Edwards turning left to 240, descending to 4,000. This doesn't feel right. I'm flying into solid weather. Morrison's response was immediate and confident. Viper 27, that's exactly what we want. In about 40 seconds, you're going to break through into a pocket of clear air. When you do, you'll have visual contact with the runway environment. The emergency convoy screeched to a halt outside the control tower, but Morrison never took his attention off the life-or-death communication with the pilot. Heavy boots pounded up the tower stairs as senior personnel responded to the crisis, but Morrison's entire focus remained on bringing the aircraft home safely. Viper 27, reduce power slightly and let the aircraft settle into the wind gradient. You're going to feel some turbulence, but trust your training and let the F-16 do what it's designed to do. The tower controllers watched their radar screens in amazement as the aircraft's track showed it following exactly the path Morrison had described, threading through weather patterns that their sophisticated systems hadn't detected. Colonel Hayes burst into the tower, followed by Chief Master Sergeant Williams and several other senior officers. The colonel was about to speak when Morrison held up his hand for silence, still focused entirely on the emergency. Viper 27, you should be seeing clear air. Now! Captain Morrison's voice suddenly exploded through the radio, filled with relief and amazement. Edwards Tower, I have the runway in sight. Gear shows down and locked. How did you know that corridor was there? Morrison smiled with quiet satisfaction that came from decades of reading weather patterns that computers missed. Son, I've been watching aircraft fight this particular terrain and weather combination for 40 years. Mountains create predictable wind corridors if you know how to read the signs. The F-16 appeared through the fog bank exactly where Morrison had predicted, lined up perfectly with the runway despite the challenging conditions. The aircraft touched down firmly, but safely, rolling out normally despite the complete hydraulic failure that should have made landing nearly impossible under such conditions. Colonel Hayes walked directly to Morrison, who was still coordinating the aircraft's safe taxi to parking. When Morrison finally set down the microphone after ensuring the pilot was completely safe, Colonel Hayes came to rigid attention and rendered the sharpest, most precise salute anyone present had ever witnessed. Chief Master Sergeant Harold Morrison, United States Air Force, retired, Colonel Hayes said, his voice booming across the suddenly silent tower. Sir, on behalf of the United States Air Force, that was the finest display of air traffic control expertise I have ever witnessed in 30 years of service. Morrison slowly returned the salute from his position at the radio console, movement still precise despite his age and the emotional weight of the moment. Colonel, no recognition necessary. That pilot did all the hard work flying a damaged aircraft through impossible conditions. I just provided a little guidance based on experience. Colonel Hayes held his salute for 5 full seconds before dropping his hand with military precision, his respect for Morrison evident to everyone in the tower. Colonel Hayes turned to address the stunned air traffic controllers who had witnessed the impossible. Airmen, allow me to introduce Chief Master Sergeant Harold Guardian Morrison, the most decorated air traffic controller in Air Force history. Chief Morrison guided over 15,000 aircraft safely through combat and emergency conditions, including over 400 emergency landings in zero visibility during the Vietnam War. The tower fell silent as the full implications sank in. They had been dismissing a living legend whose expertise had just saved a pilot's life using knowledge and intuition that no computer system could replicate. Colonel Hayes continued, his voice filled with profound respect. Chief Morrison's techniques for reading weather patterns and guiding aircraft through impossible conditions are still taught at every air traffic control school in the Air Force. His ability to see what instruments miss has never been equaled. Morrison shifted uncomfortably behind the radio console, clearly uncomfortable with public praise he had never sought during his years of quiet service. "Colonel," Morrison said with the humble dignity that had characterized his entire career, "these young controllers have excellent training and the most sophisticated equipment in the world. They just needed a reminder that sometimes technology and experience work best when they complement each other." Colonel Hayes reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small wooden presentation box along with a laminated identification card. "Chief Master Sergeant Morrison, this is your permanent tower access authorization that should have been issued 18 years ago when you began working here." He handed Morrison the card, then opened the wooden box, revealing the distinguished flying cross with its distinctive blue and white ribbon. "This belongs with you, not buried in some Pentagon storage facility where bureaucrats lose track of our heroes." Morrison looked down at the medal with emotions playing across his weathered features. "I thought that was lost decades ago, Colonel. I figured the paperwork got buried somewhere in the system after my retirement." Colonel Hayes carefully pinned the distinguished flying